In the Old Testament, one patriarch stands above all the rest in terms of his importance to the story of Israel, and he still exerts profound influence in modern-day Western culture, thousands of years later. We're talking about Moses, of course. Our religious traditions tell us that it was Moses who performed signs and wonders in the presence of the Pharaoh and his magicians, that it was Moses who inspired a nation of slaves to follow him out of captivity in Egypt and into the wilderness, and that it was Moses who gave them the laws and monotheistic principles that their society would follow for the rest of time.
Tutmosis I, his life story reads almost like a soap opera. It is so interesting what all takes place. It's a very interesting history of his family. His royal wife, whose name was Amos, bore him a daughter whose name was Hatshepsut. If you'll recall, that was one of the historians' ideas of who the Pharaoh was. Hatshepsut. That's his daughter. And Tutmosis I also had a concubine. Mutnofret was her name, who bore him a son. And he named that son, obviously, Tutmosis II. He had a daughter with Hatshepsut. Neferu Ra was her name, but she's a female. He goes on and has an affair with, or I should just say, he had a second wife, or a concubine, you might say, whose name was Iset. Iset actually fathered a son for him, whose name he gave was Tutmosis III, who would grow up without his dad, because soon after Tutmosis III is born, Tutmosis II dies. And as his son is an infant, he cannot take over the throne. Without an adult heir, they needed to have a new pharaoh. So what ends up happening is Hatshepsut replaces the king, Tutmosis II, as the new pharaoh. Yes, it was his sister and his wife of Tutmosis II, but she assumes the role of pharaoh, bypassing, this is important, bypassing this infant son, who's really, I mean, at this point, he's too young to rule. So Hatshepsut now becomes the pharaoh.
Hatshepsut was the great royal wife, and she had been unable to produce a male heir. So once more, the son of a lesser wife became king. Tutmosis III was believed to have been only 2 or 3 years old when his father died. And since he was so young, Hatshepsut became co-regent, reigning as pharaoh alongside him. Even when Tutmosis III came of age, Hatshepsut continued to rule as pharaoh alongside him. She was the first female pharaoh to rule over Egypt, and is widely regarded as a very effective ruler, undertaking an extensive building program during her reign. Now, it was Hatshepsut who drew Moses out of the water as a baby. Her involvement has raised the question of why an Egyptian princess would choose to rescue a Hebrew baby. Well, one viable theory is the dynastic crisis that the royal house of Egypt was facing. Could it be possible that when Hatshepsut saw the crying child in the basket, she saw him as an answer to Egypt's succession woes? Considering how much the Egyptians revered the Nile, and taking into account the fact that Moses was drawn out of the Nile, perhaps Hatshepsut, the pharaoh's daughter, saw him as a gift from the gods of Egypt. In fact, we know that her main reasoning for naming him Moses is because she drew him out of the Nile. Perhaps she saw Moses as an answer to her prayers.
Reigning for about 20 years, Hatshepsut only had one daughter, and scholars believe that she longed to have a son. Now, some scholars, Egyptologists, have suggested that she was so dedicated to her role of pharaoh, she didn't go off after her husband died and have other children and stuff with male concubines or whatever, that she put her endeavors and her energies into the country itself. But they also state that she longed to have her own son because she knew her daughter would never be able to become Pharaoh, especially with Tutmosis III growing up. So, according to some Egyptologists and some of the books I've written, it appears, this is sort of speculative, but this is what they believe, many believe, that Hatshepsut went down to the Nile god Hapi of the Egyptians and prayed for a son, though like supernatural means, because she was not going to marry somebody else. And that the Nile god Hapi actually granted her request and gave her a foreign male child that she found in the Nile. She brings this child into the house of Pharaoh and raises him in the house of Pharaoh with all the education and everything that the new Pharaoh would need.
Moses was raised at the royal court and was most likely viewed as a potential heir to the throne since he was the adopted son of Hatshepsut, the daughter of Pharaoh's great royal wife, and therefore considered to be part of the legitimate royal line. But the Bible says something interesting about Moses in the book of Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 24. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. From a young age, Moses understood his identity not just as a Hebrew, but also as a follower of Yahweh or Jehovah, the God of the Hebrews. This God was nothing like the gods of Egypt. Moses believed that what God had to offer him was far more appealing and more enduring than anything the gods and affluence of Egypt had to offer. As alluring as the power and wealth of Egypt was, Moses saw something more alluring in the promises of God.
Moses file. Humans ask why Egypt does not record Moses. Witness clip, Frank Turek.
But there is a figure in Egyptian history known as Senenmut.
The file flags a theory, not a stamped identification. Senenmut rises under Hatshepsut with nearly 90 titles, the claim says. Then he disappears from the record. 2 tombs built, neither used.
When you go to Hatshepsut's temple, which is not far from the Valley of the Kings, if you walk this way, right over here, down a hill, is Senenmut's tomb.
The tomb is never used. It is abandoned.
And there's an article on the Armstrong Institute website called Is This Moses? Senenmut, Is This Moses? And he makes a case that the figure in Egyptian history known as Senenmut is Moses.
In the Hatshepsut temple, and she was the woman that pulled Moses out of the water and later for a time became Pharaoh herself. Well, her name has been scratched out of her temple at certain points by Amenhotep II. He tried to replace his name with it. Why? Because Amenhotep II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus who got dope slapped by Yahweh and Moses, and he didn't want any memory of Hatshepsut who brought up Moses.
Many scholars doubt parts of the narrative. Some still argue Moses likely existed, even if details were shaped by tradition.
Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went to Babylon. What did they do? They gave them a new name, right? They're discipling them into their new worldview, their new religion. So Moses was given a different name as an Egyptian official.
So the file does not close on Senenmut equals Moses. The file tightens a different question.
The tomb is never used. It's abandoned. Gee, I wonder why. Because after Moses left Egypt and then came back to bring his people out of the land, obviously he never went back after that. Where's he buried? He's buried on Mount Nebo, which is present-day Jordan. He doesn't even go into the promised land. So his tomb isn't used. So Senenmut could be Moses. Look for that article. It's a very fascinating article. It's about 5,000 words.
If a man rose that high and vanished that clean, What happened? And if Moses existed, why does Egypt stay silent? Coincidence, silence, or a misidentified match? File updated. Case not closed.
Thank you, Christopher, for taking the time to do this interview.
My pleasure.
In your article at the very beginning, you say that one of the biggest questions in the field of biblical archaeology is who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? That's a subject that you've tackled in an article. You did an interview with Brent Noxgall about it. I think it was this time last year that article came out. So in this article, you asked the question, well, what about Pharaoh's arch rival? Is he presented anywhere in Egyptian history? And then in 5,000 or so words, you give this pretty thorough and interesting option for the identity of Moses. So what do we know about the life story of Senenmut? And then who are some of the key Egyptian players at this time as well?
Again, going back to our time frame, like this is the really critical thing, establishing the chronology. So, and we've done this in previous articles. You can find a lot of detail on our website about this. Basically, for our starting point, we take 967, which is a widely agreed upon date for the start of Solomon's Temple, from a number of different sources converging on that date as the time in which Solomon started building his temple, 967 BCE. 1 Kings 6 verse 1 gives us a period of 480 years from the Exodus to when Solomon started the temple, or it gives in the 480th year, i.e. 479 years. So winding that back gives us an Exodus date of 1446, 40-year sojourn in the wilderness, puts them arriving in Canaan, 1406 BCE. And now with that, we can apply the lifetime of Moses, which the Bible gives as 120 years, and it splits apart into 3 40-year brackets. So, and it has him dying just before the Israelites entered Canaan. Okay, so if the Israelites are entering Canaan, 1406 BCE, 120 years earlier puts his birth at around 1526 BCE. So with that date, we can compare that to Egyptian chronology. But it's not quite that simple because there are several different Egyptian chronologies. There's a high chronology, there's a low chronology, and we deal with this some in the article, but basically we align this with a high chronology to make it long story short. So this would put Moses' birth during the reign of Thutmose I. So Thutmose I, and it would put Amenhotep II as the pharaoh of the Exodus. But again, that's the subject for that that article from last year. So it puts Moses' birth during the reign of Thutmose I, and it identifies the pharaoh's daughter, the all-important pharaoh's daughter, with Hatshepsut, who was the daughter of Thutmose I. And it would make her around 10 to 15 years old at the time of the discovery of Moses, depending on what version of high chronology you go with. Okay, so that would have his discovery at that time period, and then it would basically have his first 40 years in Egypt going all the way to 1486 BCE. Okay, so do we see anything interesting during that window of time in ancient Egyptian history? Well, we do see the rise of a nobody, a no-name, to the very highest levels of princedom during this period, during the reign of Hatshepsut. So Hatshepsut, she was this royal pharaoh's daughter during the reign of Thutmose I, and especially so because she was a fully royal daughter. During this time of Hatshepsut, there's this individual called Senenmut who goes from a no-name to the highest ranks of power. He has nearly 100 different titles. He is named the Crown Prince. He's named the head of this certain League of Prophets. He's named the Royal Architect. He's named the Overseer of the Granaries. Like right down the list, all the top titles for this guy, to where some of the experts on this period, they're like, there's no way that Senenmut can even fulfill a fraction of these responsibilities. But for whatever reason, Hatshepsut is giving this no-name all of these titles. So Senenmut, he comes from a family which is often referred to as this peasant family. just this no-name commoner class. Next to nothing is known about his family. They're not mentioned with any titles. His father evidently had a pretty poor burial, but as Senenmut got older and was beginning to be raised in rank, he was able to rebury his father in a more royal kind of a way, later along with his mother. So we have this Senenmut coming from peasant status and being gradually catapulted all the way to what some say is he was the de facto ruler of Egypt, basically, under Hatshepsut. And it just matches so well with what we read about in the early Exodus account. This nobody, Moses, taken and then raised as Prince of Egypt, thanks to the kindness of what at the time was Pharaoh's daughter, who we identify as Hatshepsut, who later became a queen or a pharaoh in her own right. And then there's a lot of really interesting angles with Hatshepsut as well, and her benevolence toward foreigners, her inscriptions which speak to such a thing, her heart full of love. Like as a pharaoh, these are kind of amazing sentiments which kind of match really well with the biblical account of the pharaoh's daughter and someone who would raise this nobody to the highest level of power in the land. So I'm not sure if I answered that entirely or maybe too much. But
Well, you definitely gave a really compelling case, just as you do in your article. When I was first going through your article and I was introduced to the name Senenmut, one of my first questions was, why is the name so different from Moses? We have the Hyksos rulers, and the names there match very closely with the names of the patriarchs, the Hebrew names of the patriarchs. So I wondered, why is this name very, very different? But then, pretty quickly in your article, you give a really compelling answer to that.
okay, yeah, that's a good point. This is really the first question that has to come. Why isn't he called Moses? If Senenmut is Moses, then why isn't he called Moses? So Scott Roberts handles this pretty well, because actually the meaning of the name Senenmut is really strange as well. It means mother's brother. Like, what on earth kind of a name is this? And he sees this name as another title, like all these other titles that Senenmut has been given, and Senenmut as a personal name given to him as well, as another form of title, meaning this mother's brother, and that this was the Pharaoh, Queen Hatshepsut's way of basically elevating Senenmut to the level of pharaonic royalty by tying him in as almost a familial kind of member. Because you've got to remember that the pharaohs were like a demigod class, or even more than that. Like they were seen as divine, and so they had no interactions with the commoners like this. And so in order to make this commoner what he became, he would need to be raised to that kind of a level as well. And so that would make sense of this, in its own right, really strange name, Senenmut, meaning mother's brother. And it would kind of fit as well with this idea of adoption by a young Hatshepsut. If you look at the timeline, she would have been fairly young, 10 to 15 years old. And so not so much of a mother's son as kind of like a mother's brother. So it emphasizes that familial link and also raises him to that rank where he can be kind of classed on par with the pharaohs, with the royalty, which he very much wasn't originally.
You can't help but see some correlation between this adopted, unnamed foreigner and the story of Moses that you find in the Bible. But then Thutmose III remarries. He remarries a person named Meretre Hatshepsut, who bore him many children. The oldest son that he had was named Amenhotep II. Now, remember from the beginning of this lesson, many people thought Amenhotep II, who's in the Thutmose dynasty, was the one who might have been pharaoh. But there are a few murals that have survived and that you can see about his early reign. And in his early reign, Amenhotep II appears from all indications that he was a very healthy person. He was extremely athletic. He led campaigns, military campaigns. He was an athlete. But why is there such a lack of images and descriptions of the latter half of his reign? It's a mystery. And like I say, since Egyptians often detail victories and conquests, yet they don't often talk about defeats and bad things that happen in their reigns, it's interesting that the second half of Amenhotep's reign should be in silence. Thus, we have to speculate. Could it be that the plagues of Egypt occurred during this time? The Egyptians certainly would never have memorialized what was going on in their kingdom. A great discovery happened in 1898. Amenhotep II's mummified body was discovered by an archaeologist named Victor Loret. It was totally intact. It hadn't been attacked by grave robbers. It hadn't been plundered or anything. His tomb was totally intact. As a matter of fact, until we found King Tut's tomb, it was the only Egyptian tomb, royal tomb, that we had ever found that had never been touched by grave robbers. So it was an intact one. Now, inside this tomb was the royal sarcophagus that they found in there also. And it was totally undefiled. When they opened and started to study the remains of his mummy, they found that it had extensive damage that was done to it. Many scholars believe that it was a type of disease or plague that he was attacked by. His skin shows, and you can see pictures if you want to look up pictures or see pictures of his mummy. It's very well known. It's covered in tubercles and growths all over. It's very hideous to look at. And now some will say, well, they did the embalming wrong. Why would they do embalming wrong on him, but they don't do it on the others? No, it appears many pathological experts and stuff have studied this, and they believe it was some type probably of a disease. The exact cause of his death has never to this day been determined, what killed him. But speculating, could his death, could this condition of his body indicate that there were plagues coming down from Egypt resulting in the Exodus? And this fits the biblical time frame. There's also evidence that certain foreigners, we read about this, certain foreigners in Egypt were performing some type of magic in the second half of his reign. And that he actually commanded his people to not pay attention to these magicians that were doing this. Again, speculating. Could this magic from these foreigners be Moses and Aaron doing these miracles? The plagues of Egypt? It fits a biblical account. Another piece of evidence supporting Amenhotep II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus comes from a stela, a monument, if you will, right by the Great Sphinx of Giza. We all know the Great Sphinx. There is a monument at the front of that. It indicates that Amenhotep's oldest son appears to have died mysteriously in youth. Whoa, isn't that interesting? His name, according to the stela, was Amenhotep, who would have been likely then the heir to the throne, but he died mysteriously as a youth. Because of that, because he was deceased, his brother, Thutmose IV, succeeds him as the new ruler in his place when he dies. Again, this fits the biblical story with Passover. Exodus chapter 12, verse 29 reads, "At midnight, the Lord struck down the firstborn in all the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of the livestock." This fits this very interestingly. Finally, one more piece, amazing piece of information into this puzzle of who, of Amenhotep being possibly the Pharaoh of the Exodus. If you recall, I mentioned a city in the land of Goshen named Avaris. Avaris has been excavated for a number of years now. They're still working on it, and they believe that this was definitely a Hebrew type or Semitic village that was living in the lower part of Egypt. Now, what's amazing is about this, it's in the land of Goshen, which the Bible tells us that's where the Hebrew people lived. But what's fascinating about this is all of a sudden, that city, Avaris, is shown to be totally just abandoned. that the people who were living there just got up and left. When did this take place? During the reign, the second part of the reign of Amenhotep II. And we know that this was a Semitic place because the style of the houses are not Egyptian. They're more like what you would find with the Hebrew people. So was Avaris abandoned during the reign of Amenhotep II because the Exodus took place? Interesting. I mean, we're speculating here, but there seems to be a lot of evidence to support this. It does fit the biblical time.
Working on this article, doing all of the research, how convinced are you that Senenmut is Moses?
I think I'm as convinced as can be. It's interesting that you put it like that. Someone came by the Institute yesterday and asked that very question. On a percentage level, I said maybe 90%, but it's hard to say. You know, I'm as convinced as can be. Like, the way this lines up is just so incredible, right the way down the list. There are still questions, like the most obvious being, the thing that would settle it would be the name Moses. If ever that kind of equivocation was found, that Senenmut equals Moses, the later Egyptian priest historian Manetho of the 3rd century BCE, he writes that actually Moses used that name Moses among the Israelites and another name among the Egyptians. Which would also make sense. But kind of the question remains open-ended until you have that kind of absolute equivocation. Senenmut is Moses somewhere. But besides that, I just think it lines up so well that who else could it be?
Now, it would have been easy for Moses to forget about his ancestry and embrace the power and affluence of Egypt. He could have chosen Egypt and its gods, but instead, he chose a nation of slaves and their God. Why? Because Moses saw that what the God of the Hebrews, the God of the Bible, had to offer him was far more enduring than anything that Egypt had to offer. Egypt offered him a season of pleasure, fame and fortune, but at the end of it, he would end up mummified and ensconced in a pyramid or in a royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings. But the God of his ancestors offered him something entirely different. And what was it that the invisible and all-powerful God of his fathers offered Moses? A country that was infinitely better than Egypt, a heavenly country that would endure forever. God offered him eternity. John chapter 3 and verse 16 summarizes the hope that God offers each one of us. It's the same hope that Moses grasped, and it is also ours for the taking as well. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Through Jesus, we can not only find freedom from sin, but we can also have hope for eternity. It was this hope that Moses clung to as he found himself a fugitive in the wilds of Midian, with no home, no family, and a bleak future.